going to start with a quote today. I think Kirk is going to love this one. He couldn't have thought this up, I don't think. This is pretty good. This is Marcus Stroop. There aren't nearly enough crutches in the world for all the lame excuses. Now, some of you are going to be thinking about that. You're going to be processing that about 3 o'clock this afternoon. You're going to start laughing because you're going to get it. Excuses. Maybe you heard about the woman in Ohio who torched a bathroom in a bar, burned it to the ground, and when confronted by a police officer, "Why did you do it?" This is what she said, straight up. She said, "Because I was so stressed out by the death of Michael Jackson." Okay? Or maybe you heard about the woman who explained her teenage daughter coming down with a bad case of pregnancy after swimming in a hotel pool. Excuses. John Rooney, a professor of psychology at LaSalle University, says, any excuse is better than none. Because if you tell a good story and entertain, that's sometimes more important than the truth. Wow. Well, that seems to be the case with a lot of famous people who want to avoid responsibility. Maybe you heard some of these excuses from some folks when they got caught doing some things. Bill Belichick, he's the head coach of the New England Patriots, and when he got caught cheating, he said, "I didn't understand the rules." Or Bill Clinton, after he got caught being Bill Clinton, said, "It depends what is." Or maybe you heard about Pac-Man Jones, the famous football player, the millionaire, after his house was foreclosed on. He said, "I hadn't been getting the mortgage statements." Excuses. Paris Hilton said, "My lawyers didn't explain what a suspended license meant." Oh, that means I can't drive. Or how about after being tested positive for steroid use, Big Pappy? He said, "I know I am surprised, and I'm sure my fans are surprised, given the clean lifestyle I live. I don't know how this could have happened." Excuses. They're not just for the rich and famous. We use them too, don't we? We all have our favorite excuses, and we seem to live by this old Yiddish proverb, if you don't want to do something, one excuse is as good as another. And so we have our favorite excuses. If you're a parent, you've heard this one from your kids when you've asked them to do something and they didn't do it. "I didn't hear you. I didn't hear you." "Oh, you wanted me to mow the lawn. I didn't hear you." Spouses can use it too, you know. "Didn't you know we're going to the party?" "No, I didn't hear you." Or "Didn't you know? Did you pick up the dry cleaning?" "Sorry, I didn't hear." And then you could also use, "I didn't get the text. I didn't get the voice message. I didn't get your email." They're all the same. They work just as effectively. "I didn't know that was my responsibility." "That was my job? I was supposed to do that?" Or "I was busy." Or "I had family in town, sorry." Or "I have family coming into town." Both work just as effectively. Family is always a great excuse. "I prayed about it. I just don't feel convicted by God." That's a good one in the church. "I overslept. My alarm clock didn't go off. I have to wash my hair." Has anybody ever really used that? I mean, would that just be, I don't know if that works or not. That might just be an insult. I don't know. "My husband is working. My wife doesn't want to do it." Or when you've used all of your favorite excuses too many times on the same people and you're feeling like maybe they're growing old, sometimes what works is to just throw something out that seems a bit confusing, that will stun a person. Something like, "I meant to, but Mercury was in retrograde. Sorry." And they look at you like, "What?" And that gives you just enough time to slip away, and then you don't have to do that thing that you didn't want to do. Excuses. We're in week 3 of our series, Moses, Friend of God. And we've been studying the life of this great man, this leader, and so far we've seen that Moses is really just a guy a lot like us. And Moses, like us, had his epic failures. That Moses, like us, has been shaped by long wilderness experiences where he was shaped and formed and taught by things like discomfort and obscurity and time. And we've been seeing that Moses didn't develop the kind of relationship he had with God overnight, and neither do we, that it takes time to come to the kind of place of intimacy and connection with God like Moses experienced. And what we're learning, so we're learning what we can from his journey. And today we see, again, Moses is a guy pretty much like us. Because when he was asked to do something he didn't want to do, Moses could throw down excuses with the best of us. And so we pick up our story today in Exodus chapter 3, and we find Moses doing what he'd been doing every day for the past 40 years, tending his father-in-law's sheep. Let's pick up the story in Exodus chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. And if you were here last week, you may remember that his father-in-law's name was Ruel, and you're like, what happened with the name change? Same guy, different name. Sometimes people have two names in the Bible. He's now Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. So again, it's just another day in the wilderness office for Moses. A day like any other. Thousands of others. Moses had no clue what was about to happen to him, but God was about to interrupt his day and redirect the course of his life. And that's the way God often operates. I know this was my experience when God called me into pastoral ministry. From my perspective, it was kind of a burning bush supernatural experience, but it was a day like any other. I didn't wake up thinking to myself, I think God will talk to me today or redirect the course of my life. It was just like any other day. And that's what was the case for Moses. But God broke in that normal day, and he interrupted this normalness with a tangible manifestation of his presence for Moses. And Moses sees this strange sight. It's a bush that's burning, but it's not being consumed. And he says, I'm going to go and see this strange sight. And it's in these common, ordinary, everyday circumstances of our lives that God will occasionally, again, break in and do something altogether extraordinary. And those are the times we need to stand up and take notice, and we need to listen, because this is one of many of God's ways of communicating with us. He does it in other ways, but sometimes he will just break into your day in something extraordinary, some extraordinary circumstances. And when those things happen to us, it's a good idea to say, could God be speaking to me through these circumstances? Well, he certainly had something to say to Moses. And so as we continue to read in verse 4, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed heard the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. So God calls to Moses, and he tells him to remove his sandals, and God then introduces himself to Moses, tells him his name, and then he begins to pour out his heart to Moses, tell him what his intentions were. In a sense, he says, Moses, my heart is breaking for the plight of my people in Egypt. Their lives are hard. They've been crying out to me, and I've heard their cries, and even though they may think that I haven't heard them, that I have turned my back on them, and even though the Egyptians may think that they can live without any kind of accountability for their actions against my people, I have heard them. And I've had all that I can take, and I'm about to do something. I am about to fulfill my promises to my people and give them a land of their own. Now, up to this point, God hadn't said anything about Moses' involvement in the plan. And I could just imagine what was going through Moses' mind as he's listening to God. He's probably thinking, yeah, I know about what's going on in Egypt. And when we have traders come through here, they're telling me what's happening. And I've lying awake at night, just unable to sleep because of the plight of my people. I've imagined my mother, my father, my brother, my sister, what they must be going through. God, I'm so glad you're about to do something. It's about time, God, but yes, do something. And that's when God gets to the point. Verse 9. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Here Moses faces yet another moment of truth in his life. I mean, how he responds in this moment will have such implications not only for his life, but for salvation history, for his people. I mean, how Moses responds in this moment will determine whether Moses' life is just this blip on the vast screen of history, or whether he becomes a major player in the plans of God. And so God tells Moses, so now go. I'm sending you. And you may notice that God doesn't ask us to do things the way we're taught to ask each other to do things. You know, we're taught to be polite. We get better, responses if we, kind of ask in a kind of not so direct way. Would you consider doing this? Or I was thinking you'd be good at this. Or maybe you should pray about it and get back to me in a week. That's how we ask each other to do things. But God is God, and God asks in different ways. And God just says, now go. I'm sending you. And I can just imagine Moses being just like a deer in headlights, baffled by this. What, God? Me? You're sending me? Let's remember, Moses had already tried his hand at being the deliverer for the Hebrew people, and we remember how that went 40 years ago. And also remember, Moses didn't have the advantage that we have. He had never read the book of Exodus. He had never seen the movie, The Prince of Egypt, or the Ten Commandments. He didn't know the mighty things that God was going to do to release his people from Egypt. If only Moses would have been able to have that hindsight. Don't you think he would have responded a bit more bravely? Okay, yeah, let's go. I've been waiting. I saw the movie. I'm ready to play the starring role. Wouldn't that be great if we could live our lives and make our decisions with kind of a hindsight? Wouldn't it be great? You can just imagine the day that we'll be in heaven someday, and we'll be reading the story of our lives and looking back at the fear that we had and the worry that we had and the lack of boldness that we had. And we'll be like, man, what was I worried about? I know how the story ends. Moses didn't know how the story ended like we do. And so Moses does like most of us would have done in his shoes had God said the same thing to us. He makes excuses. And when one excuse doesn't work, Moses just goes on to another until in totality he gives 5 excuses about why he shouldn't have to go. So let's look at these excuses one at a time, see if we can't hear a bit of our own voice in the voice of Moses. Excuse number 1, verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? So Moses' first excuse, who am I? And at first it sounds like a humble reply, doesn't it? It sounds kind of polite. Oh, Moses is just being nice, isn't he? And truth be told, 40 years in the wilderness had changed him. It transformed him. I mean, 4 decades ago, Moses was signing himself up for the job. Pick me, God. You need to deliver. I will deliver the people. I am your man. But 40 years in the wilderness had brought Moses into a much deeper sense of humility and a sense of self-distrust. But however polite and humble this excuse or this response may sound, it was still incredibly inappropriate. Instead, Moses should have said, whatever you say, God. You say go, I'll go. Because that is the position of a servant. And if you are a follower of Christ, then this is the attitude that we are called to have. That whatever the question, God, whatever the command, the answer is yes before you even say it. You say go, I go. You say jump, I say how high. You tell me to do something, I will do it. The answer is yes before you ask. And I'm just wondering, disciples of Jesus, have you gotten to that place yet where you have such faith in him that you could say the answer is yes before you hear the question? Because I know what it's like for many of us. We want to wait and hear the question first so we can determine how much discomfort it might cause or how far out of our comfort zone it may take us. or whether it even makes sense to us before we say yes. And God's choice doesn't make a lot of sense to Moses. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to us either. And so Moses offers up excuse number one. Who, me? Who am I? And if we're really honest with ourselves, we agree with Moses. Yeah, who, you? I mean, again, we remember Moses 40 years ago, he failed when he was the son of Pharaoh's daughter. How can he succeed now? That's what happens, though, when we see things the way we see things, but we need to understand that God sees things a bit differently than we do. And as we'll see, for every one of Moses' excuses, God is going to counter with a promise. And I hope you understand today, for every excuse you have, God has a promise. We just heard a whole bunch of them. And so there's not an excuse you could think of that God can't say, oh yeah? Well, how about this? And that's what he's going to do with Moses. Look at verse 12. And God said, I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you, that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. And so God asks, who am I? And God responds by saying, I will be with you, Moses. And I love it. God didn't give Moses a pep talk. He didn't try to boost his self-esteem. Oh, come on, Moses. Don't be so hard on yourself. You're Moses. I picked you because you're such a great guy. Because you're so faithful. No, God doesn't say any of that stuff. In his response, it's almost as though he is affirming Moses' excuse. Yeah, Moses, you are nothing. You are nothing without me. That is why I promise I will be with you. And I can't help but make the comparison. It's much like us. Maybe you've been asked to teach a Sabbath school class, or give a Bible study, or share your faith at work, and you're like, what? Who, me? I'm no Billy Graham. I'm no fill in the blank. God ignored Moses' excuse, and he ignores our excuses as well. He ignores your excuses. He simply gives this promise. And so the answer to the question of who I am is found in knowing who God is. So what we need isn't like a boost in self-esteem. That's not what we need, counter to popular culture. What we need is to see God rightly as who he is, as the God who promises to be with us and to provide for us and to give us his power to do the things he's called us to do. And so today we can count on the same promise that was offered to Moses. Jesus said it several times, I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. I will be with you always to the very end of the age. We have that promise with us. So God has his promise. Moses moves on to excuse number 2, verse 13. Moses said to God, well, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. So Moses asks, well, what if they ask me who you are and I don't have an answer? And Moses here is imagining himself going to the Hebrews, and he's going to Egypt, and they ask him a question, and he just doesn't have enough information. And so, in a sense, excuse number 2 is, I just don't know enough, God. I don't know enough. And it's, again, much like us today, we've all experienced the same fear. Again, well, what if I do say something about being a Christ follower, and someone asks me one of those questions, and I just don't have an answer. What will I do then? Well, God gives Moses his answer. And he tells him his name. And God's name reveals so much about who he is. Tell them, I am has sent you. I am who I am. And much has been made about this name, and rightly so. It's a powerful name. It's based on the verb to be, and it's in the present tense. God says his name is I am. Not I was, not I will be, but he always is and always will be I am. In the present tense, he is the eternal. He is the self-sustaining one. And this name was intended to give Moses and the Hebrews confidence that this self-sustaining one who always is in the present tense would always be there to provide for every one of their needs. Provide for Moses' needs to answer any question that would be asked, and to provide for the Hebrews' need for deliverance from bondage. But then because Moses seems to be worried about a lack of information, God goes into incredible detail about what he's to do. Just check out what detail God gives Moses. Verse 16, go, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, God's going to tell them what to say. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt, and I have promised to bring you up out of the misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. Listen, the elders of Israel will listen to you. You might want to underline that. They will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward this people, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor, and any woman living in her house, for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and you will plunder the Egyptians. It just strikes me that I never noticed that before. God tells the women to ask the women living in the house for articles of silver and gold. He knew the men wouldn't give up their riches, but the women would, because women are so much more generous. Isn't that right? But God gives us incredible detail about what Moses is to do and what he is to say. And this is how they'll respond. He says, go to them and tell them this is who sent you, and they will listen to you. But then you're going to go to Pharaoh, and he won't listen to you, and he won't release the people unless a mighty hand compels them. And I will be that mighty hand. And you will see miraculous things, and he will let the people go, and you will go out with great plunder, Moses. And I just think to myself, wow, what incredible clarity, what amazing assurance God is giving to Moses. I mean, this just should have sealed the deal for Moses. What? You're going to do what, God? And I get to be a part of that? I mean, if I'm Moses, I think by this point I start walking, but I don't know. Moses has yet another excuse. Excuse number 3, verse 1 of chapter 4. Moses answered, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? What if, God? If they don't listen to me or believe me, what if they reject me? I'll be rejected, and I don't want to be rejected. And a lot of us can certainly relate with Moses' excuse and his fear here. Nobody likes ridicule and rejection. And again, Moses had good reason to fear rejection from the Hebrews. Again, remember the experience he had when he was younger. He already tried the role of deliverer of the Hebrews, and they had rejected him then. And again, if they rejected him when he was the powerful son of Pharaoh's daughter, they'd probably reject him when he was nothing but a smelly shepherd and a returned fugitive. So in Moses' third excuse, it's quite clear he completely ignored, failed to hear what God had said to his last excuse. Remember, God said, they will listen to you. God said it. They will listen to you. Yet the word sailed right over Moses' head, and he said, what if they don't listen to me? And we can see that it was fear that was inhibiting Moses' hearing, as often happens with us. Charles Swindoll points out that the excuse Moses offered was hypothetical. Moses asked, well, what if? And those are the words of a worrier. What if? Worriers live on those two words. What if? Many of us feed our minds on the uncertainty of tomorrow with these two words. What if? And we can't even pay attention to the promises of God because we're so worried about what might happen tomorrow. God has promised us, if you confess your sins to me, I will forgive you. But we say, well, what if he won't forgive me? Or God says, I will provide for you. I will take care of you like the flowers in the field and the birds in the air. I will take care of you. You say, well, what if I lose my job? God said, I promise you a home in heaven, a life that will never end through Christ. And yet when we're faced with sickness or death, we say, what if this is all there is? What if? Warriors feed themselves with these two words. And it causes us to lose sight of the clear promises of God. You can't hear what God is promising if you're worried about what might happen tomorrow. So Moses was so worried about what might happen, that he failed to hear from God what would happen. In verses 2 through 9, God gives his response to this particular excuse. And God says, I'm going to give you 3 signs that you can give to the Hebrew people. That if for some reason they don't listen to you, you use these signs and they will listen. The first sign, you know them. First sign, he says, throw down your shepherd's rod and it'll become a snake. And then you take it by the tail, pick it back up, it'll become a rod again. And the next one is put your hand in your cloak and pull it back out. It's going to be leprous. Put it back in your cloak, pull it out, it'll be healed again. And if that doesn't work, take some water from the Nile and pour it out on the ground. It will become blood. If the first two don't convince them, the third one will. Now, I don't know about you, but it strikes me how lame these signs are. I mean, don't get me wrong. I can't do these things, but I know God, and I'm like, really, God? I mean, that's the best you've got for the Hebrews, for the signs. I mean, knowing God, I mean, if you really want a sign, I mean, God could have been like, hey, if they don't listen to you, just say this word, and I'll stop the sun and start it moving backwards. Or you say this, and I'll move this mountain from here to there. That'll really get them. Or I'll turn the pyramids upside down, put them on a little point. Or I'll turn the Sphinx into a camel. I mean, God could have done so many amazing things, but instead he gives them a couple parlor tricks. Now, he would eventually do some amazing things to convince the Egyptians he was who he said he was. But for the Hebrews up front, he gives a couple parlor tricks. And I wondered to myself, why are these the signs that God gives the Hebrew people? Now, I don't know the mind of God, but I do know this. Faith is so incredibly important to God. And in these signs, I believe he is giving enough evidence for the Hebrews to believe, but not so much that they still wouldn't need some faith. Faith is so important to God because trust is the foundation of relationship, and he's calling these people into relationship. And he's not going to put all doubt out of their mind. He's going to say, all right, here's a couple little things, but the rest I want you to just trust me and to believe. And we may wonder in our lives why God hasn't made his plan clear to me, or why he keeps his ways shrouded in mystery, or why he won't reveal himself to me the way I continually ask him to, the way I want him to. It all comes down to faith. If we want an intimate relationship with God, then we need to learn to trust him, to have faith. Moses, however, isn't there yet. Not yet. Excuse number 4, verse 10. Moses said to the Lord, O Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you've spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. The Lord said to him, who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. So Moses' fourth excuse, I've never been eloquent, I'm slow of speech, I don't have any natural talent, God. And I love God's response to Moses' excuse. It seems that he's kind of losing his patience. If God could lose his patience, I don't know if God could lose his patience, but he's kind of getting a little frustrated, and he reminds Moses, who made the mouth, Moses? Who gives sight? Who gives the sense of hearing? I mean, do you know who you're talking to? I will help you. Speak. Trust me. What incredible patience God is demonstrating. And what incredible resilience Moses is showing. He is not through with his excuses. He has one more, and it seems to get to the very root of the problem. Verse 13. But Moses said, "O Lord, please send someone else to do it." And the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he could speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and his heart will be glad when he sees you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do." Moses' final excuse. Please, Lord, send someone else to do it. And can you hear the real root of the problem for Moses? I mean, really, this is the root of the problem. I don't want to. God, please, just send someone else. I really just don't want to do it. I simply, I don't want my life disturbed. I don't like the price tag of obedience. Egypt, God, just represents way too much risk. Thanks, but no thanks. I'm flattered that you asked, but I'm not your man. You ever see yourself in Moses? Moses, his use of excuse feels so familiar to me. I mean, when we don't want to do something, any excuse will work as well as another. And God wasn't amused, nor was he dissuaded from Moses' excuses. And he finally seems to lose his patience with Moses, and he says, fine, you don't think you could talk? You don't think I can empower you to talk? You don't trust me to empower your lips? I'm going to give you Aaron as a mouthpiece. It's a concession you'll later regret because your brother's going to become a major pain in your neck, but you asked for it, you got it, now get going. And after that, Moses has nothing else to say. He has apparently run out of excuses. And as I read this account in the life of Moses, I can't help but find myself thinking, God gives such incredibly specific counsel to Moses. I mean, he tells him what to do, where to go, what to say, when to do it, who to say it to. And I think, wow, if God can only speak to me like that, if God can only make his will for me so clear, like this burning bush experience, I would surely obey everything God asked me to do. God, just tell me all that stuff, what to do and who to say it to and what to do. I will do what you tell me to do, no problem. You ever find yourself thinking that kind of thing? If God would just tell me what to do, I would do it. But then I realize that's just one of my excuses. Like, wow, I think I see an excuse in that. Because he has made our calling and our mission crystal clear. I mean, Jesus tells us to take up our cross and follow him in loving God in deeper and deeper ways and loving people by serving them. He tells us to go and to make disciples, to obey everything he has commanded us. I mean, yet our excuses just start to flow. Who am I? I don't have any natural talent. I don't know enough. What if I'm rejected? Frankly, I don't want to. And God's promises are the same to us. Again, for every excuse, he's got a promise. But I'll be with you. And I'll give you the words to say, as well as the gifting needed to do the job. I'll empower you, and I'll surround you with people to walk with you. I will be to you the I am, the ever-present, self-existing one who will live in you and empower you and be with you. It's still, we dig in our heels and offer up lame excuses. What is the area of your life right now where God is hearing nothing from you but excuses? Where are you keeping God and his calling and his mission in your life kind of just at arm's length? You know, I would imagine maybe there's someone here today who has been putting off saying yes to Christ, becoming a Christian, and following him. And there's probably some good excuses. What if God asked me to do something at some point that I'm not willing to do? Or I think God might put a cramp in my style and inhibit my life and my joy. Today's the day to put aside all the excuses and to embark on the greatest adventure of your life and of eternity, walking with and being in relationship with the creator of the universe. Or maybe the area of your life is maybe you've been feeling impressed to speak a word for God in the workplace or at school. But then the excuses start. I don't want to be rejected, or I don't want to offend them, or, what if they think this of me? It's time to put aside the excuses. Or maybe he's been calling you to spend more time with him. Work on your relationship with him. First thing in the morning, before you go to bed, whatever it is, just kind of listen for his voice, do some journaling, read the Bible, talk to him. But the excuses come. I'm just too busy. I have way too many important things to do. I don't have time for that. It's time to put aside the excuses. Or maybe it's some area of service in your community, in your church, or God's just moving you to serve where you are. And you say, well, I just don't have any natural talent. And God says, I will be in you, and I will provide for you. His calling on our lives is clear. The problem for us aren't the areas of gray. The problem is when we get to the areas that are so clear and we choose to continually excuse those callings away. And just think of how much we miss when we do. Just think of what Moses might have missed had he not followed God to Egypt. What would Moses have missed out on? Just think, as he's there offering up all these excuses to God. His place in history is hanging in the balance. All of the honors and the adventures that he would experience were hanging in the balance. His intimacy with God was hanging in the balance. And this is where we see the contact point between lame excuses and developing a relationship of intimacy with God. And again, that's the point of the series, that Moses experienced this great intimacy with God like none other. And as we study his life, we learn how we too have intimacy with God. And this is the point. If Moses had continued to make excuses and say no, he never would have developed a relationship with God that he ultimately did. He had to finally say yes, take a huge risk, step into an area of his life that was completely uncomfortable, that he had no idea what was going to happen, and put himself in a place where he had to trust God 100% because he couldn't do it. And it's in that place that Moses learned to know God like none other. And the same is true for us. It is as we get out of our comfort zone and say yes to stuff we're scared about and say yes to stuff we don't want to do, that we put ourselves in a place where we have to be 100% dependent on God, and that is the place where intimacy is born. Just like Moses, we will be brought closer to the heart of God by getting out of our comfort zone to do his will. I mentioned earlier this calling into pastoral ministry I experienced, and again, I wouldn't probably ever be able to convince anyone else it was a burning bush experience, but to me, it was. I'd been a Christian for 3 years, living in a very comfortable life, had my own business, just had a house built, had been living in it for 6 months, great church family, wonderful group of friends, and it was a normal day, and I went to bed, and God just put the Holy Spirit over me and began to speak, and I heard. And he began to say, this is what I want you to do. I want you to become a pastor. You're going to go to school, and you're going to sell your house and all these different things. And the excuses started to come. But God, I have a business. And he said, you're going to move it. But God, we just bought this house. And he said, I'm going to sell it. I said, but my wife, she'll never go for this. Leave her to me. Finally, I said, God, but I love living in Colorado. And he said, I'll send you back. And that started a journey. After all the excuses were done, and I finally said, okay, that started a journey that has given me the ability to see things and experience things and have to depend on God in ways I never thought possible. And I wonder, I go back, I say, what if in that time I would have just continued to offer excuses and said no? I never would have become the person that God is shaping me into, the intimacy that I'm able to enjoy with God, the people I've been able to meet, the things I've been able to see. And it all came down to one calling and one yes. And I know God's not calling us all into pastoral ministry, but the truth is he is calling all of us to something. And the question is, are you listening? Are you listening? It's time to stop the excuses and take the first step to Egypt. Let's pray.